Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. We're just going to wait for a few more attendees to get dialed in and we shall begin. Thank you. Hello, afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the third series within the webinar series for the ZDL group. This one we shall be focusing on security and it becoming that board level problem. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, but first just to introduce myself. My name is Daniel Wood and I'm the Group Chief Information Security Officer at the ZDL Group. I've been doing this for a number of years now, working in various different sizes of organisations, various different sectors and industries. Joining me today is my colleague, Steve Giaccardi. Steve, just a quick introduction to the audience.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon. I've been working in and around IT for like the last 20 odd years and focusing, I suppose, mostly on governance, risk and compliance and doing ISO 27001. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, and also joining me today is Kevin Swatridge.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm Kevin Swatridge, also a security consultant here at ZDL Group. And yeah, much like Steve, focusing on helping organizations achieve their security standards, certifications, and helping them with security and privacy.
Brilliant, thanks ever so much. Over the course of today, it is an interactive session. We will be asking you and challenging you with some questions, and if you do have any questions for us, please do post them in the chat. What we will do is either respond to them towards the end of the session, or depending on time, is come back to you with specific answers for your specific questions. But without further ado, let me take you through the overview of today's session, where we'll be looking at security. Why should the board care? Whose responsibility is security, and we'll be looking into the differences between responsibility and accountability, and also just how to get your voice heard should you not always have the amount of time or focus that you need from your board members. So first and foremost, we'll be going into why should boards care. One thing I'd like you just to consider very quickly though is three things that we're going to be covering off. We're going to be looking at the evolving threat landscape. We shall also be looking at things like the increase in cybersecurity risk and new regulations on things like data security and privacy. Okay, before we start, I have a very, very quick question for you, the audience, and shortly you will see a poll pop up, but a quite simple question is, what do you think the global cost of cybercrime was in 2022? The poll is open, so you'll be able to go through those answers very shortly with us when we reveal. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Steve, and we're just going to go through that evolving threat landscape.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Okay, it was the Accenture director, Bob Kress, in a Forbes interview discussing cyber threats towards the end of last year, who said, and I quote, "We are at a defining moment in cybersecurity. Geopolitical tensions and conflicts are creating new threat actors, targets, and motivations for cybercrime and disruption. And insider threats are increasing, as they always do during periods of economic instability. Ransomware attacks could continue and likely escalate in frequency and impact, and the maturity of the active cyber adversary that every organization faces and the exponential increase in what's at stake from a business value perspective has created this defining moment. What's more, systemic cyber risk has introduced an inherent and distributed risk environment that most, if not all, organizations and boards are ill prepared to handle. The day of reckoning is at hand for corporate directors and their effectiveness in governing these issues. And I think this is illustrated in the regulatory changes that have come into effect over the last few years. There was 2018, which saw the GDPR come into play, and then that was closely followed by the California Privacy Act. Then you had PIPEDA in Canada in 2020 and the LGPD in Brazil. And all of these focused on personal data and the individual's rights. And earlier this year, the SEC Form 8K ruling came into play, which stated that the registrants, which were the companies that are assigned up to the Security and Exchanges Commissions, must disclose any cybersecurity incident that they determine to be material and to describe the material aspects of the incident's nature, scope, and timing, as well as its material impact or reasonably likely material impact on the registrant. And now, to comply with that, this means that the companies registered with the SEC, those registrants that we talked about, their businesses, or especially the boards within those businesses, need a level of confidence in both their ability to detect that the incident has occurred and the means of quantifying the impact to determine whether the incident or a series of related incidents are material in their effect. And of course, the SEC have also stated that information must be provided to them within 4 days. Now, this has also opened a really interesting loophole, because what's already happening is that cyber criminals are taking advantage of this and are contacting the authorities to inform the authorities that the company has been ransomwared and that they have not added that information or passed that information on to the regulators. So this is now, is this the criminals doing their civic duty, or is this just malicious intent? Either way, the business is now between a rock and a hard place. It's got to register itself with the regulators and say that they've been breached and therefore face the huge fine. They've also then got the problem of dealing with the ransomed hardware. Do they pay the attackers? And of course, we always say you should never pay the ransom, but they need to get those systems back. And when we're talking about the systems, we're looking at ransomware as a service. We're looking at you get what you pay for attacks. All of this stuff is now happening out there on the dark web, where people are saying, okay, we've got the credentials for, and I think earlier this morning we saw that the credentials for a large British retail organisation are available on the dark web for a starting price of something like £1,000. So this shows you that you get what you pay for attacks are out there and happening. Now, Kress used the term systemic cyber risk. But what did he actually mean when he was referring to systemic cyber risk, and how do you articulate it? So let's just take a moment and think about the effect that a weak password can have, for example. And is this an example of a systemic cyber risk? Well, you think about the domino effect that just that weak password can have. It can have an effect within your own organization, but it's not just your own organization, is it? Because it's got the potential to cause widespread and serious damage across interconnected networks, across interconnected companies, and maybe potentially into critical infrastructure. In today's digital world, everything is connected, and the complexity and interdependence make it challenging to predict and deal with these risks effectively. And it's not just a local problem. Systemic cyber risks can have a global impact, a global reach. An attack on one side of the world can impact countries and regions far away. And I know you might think, oh, this is ridiculous and it doesn't happen. But today, you just think about it. There's an ongoing Australian ports crisis. There are ports in several Australian cities that have been shut down due to a massive cyber attack. This has triggered concerns about shortages of key supplies across the festive season over there in Oz. Then it's been described as a serious and ongoing cybersecurity incident. The hit port operator, DP World Australia, controls 18 ports in the country through terminals in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Fremantle. And the impact of this attack, some economic experts are saying, could ripple through the broader economy and help trigger another interest rate rise. So systemic cyber risk is a real and growing threat, and it's something that has to be dealt with as a team effort. You've got to have governments, businesses, and other players needing to work together to strengthen cybersecurity, to share information, and to cooperate internationally. But where do we as CISOs sit? How do we get our boards to understand this threat that's out there, and how do we articulate these threats so that they can be able to respond to and set the businesses up to deal with those? Dan, is there anything you can do to help me get this message out there, please?
Well, when you take a look at the increase of cybersecurity risk out there, it's reported that 2 in 3 small to medium organizations will actually go out of business within 6 months of suffering a cyber attack. So providing information to your board, providing palatable information to the board is one of the key aspects of ultimately getting them to stand up and listen. When you take a look and think that 91% of all breaches start with that individual email or mass email distribution that only takes 1 click to click on, you see the extent of the problem. It was reported in Q2 of 2022 that there were 106 million ransomware attacks occurring, which is an absolutely astronomical number. And that number had actually gone down over the previous, compared to previous quarters. So it's a real problem that is operationally damaging to the organization. An interesting point that I want to pick up on there, Steve, and actually I want to bring Kevin in here as well, because previously you mentioned around the SEC and actually threat actors almost grassing companies up. Kevin, do you see a trend happening there at all?
Absolutely. I think from one perspective, the trend is everyone who has a vested interest in the success of an organization is going to look to protect their investment and ensure the economic stability of those companies and of its investors and of the money that flows through those organizations. So we've moved beyond regulators of privacy and data to regulators of economic boundaries around an organization and ensuring that they are safe and not going to be impacted on the stock exchange. However, also to the point whereby there is leverage from a cyber attacker's perspective in order to say, yes, we're going to go out there and say that we did that attack, that we're going to share that information, that we're going to put you on the spot. There's no hiding from it anymore. Organizations can gloss over the fact that it may have happened to them in order to save face and limit the impact of the reputational damage that goes along with cybersecurity incidents. So yeah, I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing happening.
So the ICO are probably going to be inundated, but this time from the unwanted and undesirable threat actors that are actually out there having data that has not necessarily had a company hold their hands up and say, yes, we have had a breach.
Absolutely, we've seen a number of those.
Absolutely. So we asked a question earlier, the global cost of cybercrime. I will have a look at the results. We had nobody select 7 billion. 50% of the audience actually opted for 70 billion. 17% of the audience was on 700 billion, and 33% of you guys out there thought that 7 trillion was that number. 7 trillion, it was in fact reported as the global cost of cybercrime in 2022. Just to put this into a little bit of perspective for you, and again, please do use these stats to, shall we say, scare the board to a certain degree, but that looks like $583 billion a month, $135 billion a week, $19.2 billion a day, $101 million an hour, $13.4 million a minute, and a fairly palatable Cristiano Ronaldo weekly salary a second. So it's scary figures. Steve, just on the cost of the average breach, where are we at?
Well, we're reportedly at about 4.5 million on the average cost of a data breach, and then that doesn't really take into account, I don't think, the longer term consequences, like the loss of reputational damage, the brand value, the loss of customers, the whole derailing of your business operation that you have to salvage after the effects of a data breach have come to light. I don't think 4.5 million really is a true reflection of the impacts that cybercrime has on businesses. What about you, Kev?
Well, I think the fact that it's an average, so for a lot of organizations, they might be paying hundreds of thousands, because what we do know is the cyber criminals that are perpetrating these crimes are well researched, and they know what those organizations can afford. And of course, we've seen some of those numbers reach close to the billions now for certain chip manufacturers, shall we say. So it's a very broad range, but irrespective of what that number is for a given organization, it's guaranteed to bring with it a significant amount of pain. Back to Dan's point, on the basis that 2 out of 3 organizations are going out of business as a result.
Absolutely. So something we're asking is, and asking you to actually consider, how much has your organization spent on your cybersecurity controls in the past? Has it increased year on year based on the new facts and stats that we're seeing out there that nobody is omitted from threat actor groups on being a target? What's your, we're in the festive season of giving. What are you asking for? What's your budget plans look like for 2024? And actually, how do you speak to the board, and how do you actually ask for that? How do you put it behind you? I think one of the key things that we'll look at now is risk, Kevin, right? And some information
Absolutely.
on how to actually make it quantifiable.
Absolutely, and that's what the board really needs to hear, that it's been understood in a way that makes their decisioning as easy as possible. And the only way in which I've seen that work, or I know how to make that happen, is to be able to quantify that risk in the simplest way possible. There are, as described here, a number of different models to doing that, but the best model that you've got is the one that the board is already using, to be able to make your cyber risk register and its calculations align or the same as the company and organizational risk process, enables you to effectively position your cybersecurity requirements against all of the other business requirements. Otherwise, often what can happen is you can walk in with this very well-researched, well-documented risk register, but you're comparing apples and pears. And it becomes difficult for the board to then extend their understanding to a new set of risks and know how that compares to something else in terms of, maybe building a new application or opening a new branch or whatever that may be, has to be able to be compared to the potential of that painful cybersecurity attack.
Perfect. So what we're actually going to take a look at now is who should actually be responsible. We're going to look at things from a different board perspective and different board members' perspective. We want to define responsibilities versus accountabilities because there's often a grey line sometimes drawn between them that is not defined. We're also going to look at the security's evolving role within companies and how that has changed over the many years. But again, first, what I'd like to challenge the audience with is a question, and that is, what do you think the average cybersecurity budget was in 2022 as a percentage of the IT budget? Shortly, there will be a poll, hopefully being distributed to you, where you can make your choices. In the meantime, let's just take a look at the board perspectives. So, as a reasonable question, how to capture and report cyber consistently with a business view. We're looking at things from the CEO's perspective. And a typical question, is the expected financial loss considering our current exposure to cyber risk?
Dan, that's a tough question. It's like, how would you respond to that? Because what is the expected financial loss considering our cyber risk exposure? I mean, as a
it's a
CEO,
tough question.
yeah, that's a rotten question. How do I respond to something like that, Dan?
Look, as a security lead for your organization, you are there to be challenged because ultimately the CEO and the board or the managing director and the board are there to ask the tough questions. You're asking them for something, they want responses in return. Again, a typical answer, I don't know, let Kevin, what do you think? Typical answer, how would you respond to that?
I mean, the thing is the way in which you are able to respond to that. I mean, the difficult part is translating the question. So they're not going to frame that question that's easy for you to answer. They're going to say the bottom line is, tell me how much it's going to cost. That's a very difficult thing to quantify considering the vast scope of all of the potential types of attacks and the severity of those. However, the more research you put in, the more time and effort you put into understand your operation, your IT infrastructure, that detailed business impact assessment that identifies where the vulnerabilities are and the impact of those being offline gives you a credible response in terms of, well, if this happens, this is a real world expectation based on some detailed analysis. And from my experience, that's what CEOs want to hear. They don't want to hear you shooting from the hip going, it's going to be quite bad. What I want to hear from you is, we've looked at this, we've measured this, we've understood it, we know what our RPOs, we know what our RTOs, we know how long we can survive without this system in place. Here are our backups, here are the alternatives. However, this is what we need to be able to be prepared to pay should this worst case situation happen. So it's all about preparedness for me.
And you're taking it back then to that risk element that you've identified. If you identify the assets to an organization that are valuable to you, they come at a cost, they come at a price. The price of having them operationally drives business. The price of having those non-operational is business loss. So then we can quantify an actual financial figure on assets, your critical assets to the organization, being unavailable to work. Thus, we can hopefully answer that question in a way of putting tangible information in front of them for financial loss if a system or a product or a service is operationally unavailable. Hope that answers your question, Steve. Tough CEO out there.
It does answer my question. It does, and it also brings me back to my old adage that security begins with A. I love it. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely, no problem at all. And if anybody's done any of these webinars with Steve in attendance, you'll know that A stands for assets as always. So moving on, just looking at some other, and if you are privy to being on the board, the security lead will always look for what initiatives should we prioritise to maximise that risk reduction. Again, leveraging the information we provided earlier around identifying our critical assets and how to protect them to maximise the reduction of the risk to them. Looking further into the business, what is the risk exposure? Again, risk analysis, it always comes down to risk, business risk, and what are the key drivers behind that risk and how to protect against them. CFO, the money men out there, how do we show value for security while trying to manage cost? I think we threw out the stat earlier, $4.5 million now is the average, depending on where that sits on what you're asking for. The return of value is not being a victim of having to pay out that financial weight due to fine or business operational loss. Looking at a risk officer, and normally for the slightly larger organizations, do we have sufficient cybersecurity coverage? It's an interesting one actually, Kevin, right? Because we've seen companies that have actually decided not to invest in cybersecurity as that comfort blanket, but actually use that funding elsewhere to increase their maturity.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's been a very volatile space, especially where difficult conversations have been had between those people paying those insurance premiums and whether or not they pay out. And I think some of the more challenging points were around if your attack was perpetrated by someone who could potentially be called a nation state, it's an act of terrorism. As such, you don't get paid from your insurance, and these things have been duked out in the courts. But the outcome of these things and the proliferation and expansion of that threat landscape and the probability that organizations will be impacted by a security breach means the premiums have gone through the roof and the coverage is reduced. So the value that you get from those kind of insurance premiums, whilst we would always recommend that people get them, it's not quite the same as simply improving your security and reducing the potential of that attack actually happening.
Perfect, thank you. And I guess just to round off the board itself, are we investing in the right security capabilities to properly protect our assets? There it is again, Steve, assets. It always goes back to them because ultimately that is what they're quite often the money makers, or that's what's driving the operational business forward. So again, just differing perspectives there from the board. But I want to dive into a little bit of responsibility versus accountability, because there is a distinguishing difference between the two, of which most of you, in fact, probably all of you know on the call today. But just to put it into real simplistic terms, responsibility is about the obligation to complete a task that has been assigned, whereas accountability is the duty to ensure that task is completed and the consequences for it not being. If we're looking at delegation, again, you are looking at a responsibility can be shared or delegated amongst a team or other teams, whereas accountability should be and is always assigned to that one person. There is one single point of contact for accountability. Responsibilities are quite often task focused. There is a set of tasks to achieve, whereas accountability is very much results focused. How did those tasks come to fruition, and the results of those, were they expected? When we look at other things, again, I just mentioned it earlier around tasks. Well, they can be delegated through responsibility, because you can have delegated responsibilities within your teams. Accountability, again, sits at the very pinnacle and cannot be delegated. So looking at that in a typical governance structure when information security is concerned, what we have is the CEO or the board very much at that pinpoint and at the forefront of accountability, the decision makers, the setting of the strategy, normally the business strategy. The responsibility of security is often referred to as operational responsibility, and alignment and advisory to the board and the strategy of which the company's direction is going. The CISO or head of InfoSec or whoever the lead is within the organization can then delegate responsibilities of operational delivery to a security team, IT team, or even other operational teams when it comes to HR, finance, etc., etc. This is where the controls of security are actually then embedded. I think quite simply, putting it in layman's terms, it's a well-known quote that many people talk to, and that is security is everybody's responsibility within every organization, as well as our own information security is our responsibility in our private lives. I'm going to open this up. Steve or Kevin, who would like to talk to incident management and a typical response structure?
Love to.
I think that's Kevin's bag, definitely.
Look at that. And I think, you know, everyone on the call, I'm sure, is familiar with some sort of incident response process or framework and the developing of their CISO and who's involved. And, you know, this gives us that overview of who are the key players in context of a relatively serious incident and who gets involved in being able to combat that. And ultimately, if it's going to have a significant business impact, be that financially or operationally or whatever that may be, you really need your CEO to be part of that process in order to be able to ensure that you are investing the right people and time and sending out the right messages in order to effectively protect your organization. And you know, the unfortunate reality is that guy in the middle, the CISO, the incident response manager or lead or captain or controller or whatever you want to call him, is going to be the person coordinating that response, the person who is going to be taking that information from the operational teams, the IT teams, the security teams, the third parties that are providing services to protect his organization, and converting that into language and into decision points that the senior leadership are able to absorb and make those decisions. So once again, this is where it's absolutely critical for that person to be able to effectively communicate with the board in a way that makes it simple for them to understand what's going on. It's a foolish person that expects the board not to understand, because they're a board. They're usually full of very smart people. However, the technical knowledge may slightly, you know, depending on the organization, may not be the easiest thing to understand, but they understand decisions. We do this or we do that. This is my recommendation based on X, Y, and Z. We could do this. There are benefits over here. Please help me make that decision in order for us to combat this particular situation.
So in very simplistic terms, then, Kevin, what we're talking about is from the responsibility of the support team, providing the core team during an incident the right information to recommend the right decisions that goes into the incident response manager up to that leadership team, and then ultimately sits at the very top, that they have tangible information to make conscious business decisions based on the incident at hand.
Absolutely, absolutely. Most concisely said.
Perfect, thank you. And I picked on Kevin last time, so I'm going to pick on you now, Steve. RACI model, what's all that about?
Well, it's responsibility, accountability, consulting, and informed. Basically, what we're looking at here is we're looking at a series of typical incidents that may occur within an organization. And we're then saying, well, who's basically responsible for that, who is accountable for it having happened, who would be consulted in the event that it happened, and who should be informed that it has happened. So looking across the first one, we're talking about a data breach or a data loss, and we're saying that the responsible person would be the CISO. And why would the CISO be responsible? Because they should be the people that have identified what controls should be in place throughout the rest of the organization, and therefore have recommended that those controls should be there. The accountable person is the CEO, because as we've seen previously, he's at the top of the chain, and he's the person who's going to be holding the bucket for the rest of the team when it all goes wrong. And he's the one who's got to stand there and will be answering to the press when they come around looking for an explanation of how this breach has occurred. The consulted people, now, there's a problem here, I think, because we've missed off the DPO, and I think if any data breach or data loss, the DPO should be consulted and should probably be at least maybe even responsible for some of this. But we'll go with what we have here, and we'll say that the consultant will be the CFO, because we're going to need to talk to him about the potential for putting aside an amount of money to pay the potential fine to the ICO. And I think in our informed area, we've got our interested parties, which would be anybody who's affected by that data breach. And I guess we can dump our DPO down there as a very, very interested party who's probably going to be shouting at me because I haven't put him in the air as a responsible person. But likewise, if we go down and look at something like the phishing attack, again, we would say that the CISO is probably responsible, because he should have identified the training that might be necessary for the teams to be able to understand and identify what a phishing attack looks like. They might also have been responsible for implementing the controls around the mail gate to make sure that the phishing emails weren't getting through. Accountable, again, as always, it's the poor CEO. This is why they do get those nice salaries. Consulted, again, we said the CFO here because we're going to assume that it's a phishing attack. We're going to assume that it was a spear phishing attack that was trying to persuade somebody somewhere to ask the CFO to sign a check on behalf of the CEO to release a holidaying relative in Cuba. And it does happen, I believe. And again, in forward, we've said shareholders, because they would probably need to be informed. Maybe, maybe not. I think that's a decision for the CEO to make. And again, we've taken this all the way through. I think the special one to look at is probably the malicious insider, because I think if we refer back to the statement from Kress earlier, which we saw on the first slide, he said that during times of economic upheaval, the possibility for insider threat increases. Now, we had a little discussion about that because we thought that was a very, very interesting statement to make, and we were a little bit unsure as to why Kress would have said something like that. And we came to the conclusion that what he was really referring to was those people who are in slightly lower paid positions, but they have access to information that would be or could be of use to somebody outside of the organization. And if the potential came that somebody was to meet somebody in a pub and say to them, oh, you work at such and such a place, how would you like to earn a quick £2,000? Now, £2,000 may not be a lot of money, but it might be just what you need when you're coming up to Christmas. So you'd hand over your username and password and think nothing more of it. That person now has access to Office 365. And as we say, we're looking at systemic risk. So they've got access to an account. What could they do with that account? They could probably get in and move laterally across your organization. So we say we'd consult with HR, because you'd have to have disciplinary actions to probably take against the person who created that that cyber breach, that malicious insider action. And again, the interested parties would be the potentially the ICO. It would be the people who may have had their accounts broken into. Who knows? But it would definitely, there would be those interested parties who would need to be informed around the malicious insiders. And potentially, in that instance, that could be the authorities, should one wish to take it that far. I think that's pretty much what I really want to say there. We could talk about responsibility and accountability, the RACI around different data loss and data cybercrime situations for hours. But again, each situation is going to have a different set of circumstances. But I think the thing that really struck me when we were putting this together was that the responsible person is pretty much always the poor CTO or the CIO or the CISO, and the always accountable person is the one at the top of the chain, the poor old CEO. I think that's all I've got to say there, Dan.
No, thank you, Steve. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And again, typical examples of some of those breaches out there and how it does impact operationally across the board. But look, I mean, there's been much said around cybersecurity and the evolving role of the security leads within the organisation. In fact, Gartner done some research last year, and it does make quite interesting reading that compared to 2016, there's been a huge increase in cybersecurity being viewed as an actual business risk rather than a technology risk. So you can really see the shift now coming into businesses and the reality on many boards that they do need to take this seriously and they do need to start thinking about it. I think for us security leads out there and on the call, that's 50% of our work done. Quite often the easiest bit and the toughest bit is then convincing them on that your way to secure their organization is the best way. But like I said, the tides are changing. It is now seen more of a business risk, which is great for us because, like I said, that's half our work done. Just taking that into account and looking across the globe, a 77% global average of cybersecurity being viewed as a business risk. And again, some interesting areas there where the UK and Spain in this instance is actually leading the way in regards to company boards really understanding that it is a wider problem and not just something that is isolated to technology. Again, with all this change, we ask the question, is the CISO or the security lead considered that C-suite role? Well, unfortunately, despite the increase, and again, there's been a 30% increase, over a double increase in the amount of security leads now established within organizations of reputational sizes. Only 14% of them actually say that they sit on some form of advisory committee, or better still, the board itself, to really be that influential party when it comes to securing the organization. So whilst the tides are turning, not quite there yet in regards to getting a seat at the big table. In fact, Steve, we've done a little bit more research in this, haven't we?
We did. We were looking at the highest placed sort of people within organisations who are accountable for cybersecurity. And we can see here that it's usually the Chief Information Officer or the CISO, the Information Security Officer, who is usually the highest person within an organisation responsible for cybersecurity. Now, there are sort of like pros and cons for this. The cons really, or the things that are limiting this, are the fact that both the CIO and the CISOs, they may be really good with technical abilities, but they may not have they may be challenged in articulating cybersecurity, a bit like me, be challenged in articulating this situation, be challenged in articulating risks and strategies in business terms. And this can hinder effective communication with the non-technical executives that they've got up there on the board. And the CISO might also struggle with securing the necessary budgets and resources for cybersecurity initiatives, especially if these decisions are made at levels higher than they are. And then they've got to go and convince the executive leadership of the need for substantial investments, which we've already stated might be a problem because they're not really that good. And this is why you're all here, to understand how to be able to phrase your requirements in a language that the board's going to understand. And then I think the last thing that really comes to play here is that very often the CISOs and the CIOs might be a distance from the strategy that the business is going on. So you really do need to align cybersecurity with your business goals and your business strategy to be able to get the best use out of that investment. Because if you're deciding that you want to invest in, for example, a whole new set of laptops, and the business has decided that they don't want to use laptops, they want to move over to small form factor PCs because they've got a whole new idea about having everybody working out of this new office that they haven't told you about, then there's going to be quite a dichotomy there of goals of where the business wants to go as opposed to where you as a cybersecurity professional need to go. So there needs to be a coming together, an understanding of the business strategy along with the cybersecurity strategy. And then the thing that really surprised me the most was that 25% of the people that are highest in organizations are those who don't have any IT expertise at all. And the problem here is that then you've got a technical gap, because how could you have people that are not aware of the controls that are required to mitigate the risks? They don't understand the risks properly that the business could be facing, which can lead to a problem in making decisions. So there can be delays in decisions, which can be detrimental, particularly in situations where quick, decisive action is required to mitigate cyber threats. And again, you have the communication, the problems of communicating complex cybersecurity concepts to the board and other executives. I don't know why I write all these long words and then try and say them, because I always trip myself up. And this may be challenging for non-IT senior managers, and this could potentially lead to misunderstandings and inadequate support for cybersecurity initiatives. And for me, I think what really needs to come out of this is that there should be cross-training. We should ensure that CISOs have a solid understanding of business operations, and non-IT managers have a good understanding of cybersecurity fundamentals. There should be some means of effective communication, particularly maybe training to help CISOs to be able to understand and talk up to the board. And we should encourage collaboration between IT leaders and business leaders so we can make informed decisions that balance security and business objectives. That sort of really is what I came to the conclusion of there, Dan, when you set me off looking at the evolving roles.
No, thank you, Steve. Thank you. Well, look, we asked a little question earlier again around the average cost or the average budget, the security budget in 2022 in relevance to their IT budget. 50% of you said 5.7%, 38% of you said 10.7, with the remainder in the 15.7 area. Absolutely, it was that 5.7. And just to put that into some perspective for you again, broken down into industry here. Now, this is an interesting one, because from what this looks like, it seems that smaller businesses are in fact spending more on their cyber budget, but this is a percentage, so not relevant to the actual pounds and pence spent. What we're going to do is move on. So, look, with everybody, most company boards now agreeing that cybersecurity is a company risk. How can us, the security leads, change that narrative on the board that we should play our part, we should be there? For this, what I wanted to do is go on to actually getting your voice heard, and go through some specifics. We're going to look at speaking the board's language. We're then going to move on to becoming an enabler, not another blocker. I think there is many a blocker within the organisation at the moment, and again, security is quite often seen as that blocker. It's always a no, you can't, because ultimately what you're trying to do is protect. But enabling yourself to not be that person will hopefully then gain the advocates on the board and not just more enemies. So if I'm presenting, what should I cover? What should I cover when I present to the board? Quite simply, there is no simple answer to that. There is no simple answer. But if you take in consideration and align your presentation, your time with the board to the business and strategic objectives of the organization, as Steve and Kevin have earlier alluded to. Consider client and customer focuses. If you are a client or customer facing business, if you're in e-commerce, if you're in retail, or the customers are the crust of your organization, consider their impact, their reputational, their reputations on how they perceive your company. Consider that in your presentation as well. How can you secure them further? Always consider operational stability and continuity, because ultimately that's what keeps the business going. And the protection of data. And I've said it once again for you, Steve, it's around risk to your assets, your key assets. If that's data, if it's a technology, if it's your people, assets are all among us.
There's
Gents, I'll open that up. Yeah, Steve.
The only thing that really strikes me with all of this, though, Dan, is that first point, the business strategy and objectives. If that hasn't been shared down to you and you've been asked to come in and present, how do you then meet that? How do you present something to align to that strategy if you don't know what the strategy or objective is?
Well, I think just in general, I mean, quite often organizations will actually post their, not necessarily their in-depth strategy, but certainly their goals, their aspirations on their website, because they want people to know what the company aspires to be and do. And I think for me, it's, if you are presenting and you are given time, go and find out, go and ask the right people, because ultimately what you're trying to do as that security lead is protect the strategy by protecting what's driving those objectives forward to make them successful. You're securing, you are their protection layer, their heat shield against all the nasties out there to enable them to actually achieve these objectives. Nobody's going to ever turn around to you and say you're not allowed to know it if you're the one put in front of it to protect it.
Thank you.
Just on that, it does kind of lead me on to some, I guess, some very obvious sometimes do's and don'ts. But when you are presenting, always be factual. Don't make it up. There are, as you can see today, plenty of statistics out there that are industry and sector aligned to wherever your business lies that you can use. I think, as you did earlier, Steve, you challenged Kevin and I. Be challenged. Absolutely be challenged. If you are being challenged and they are driving questions, it means they're driving conversation. Keep that conversation engaged. Don't wing it or blag it. If you don't know, it's always better to be honest and say, I don't know that answer. But that in turn will be an excuse to follow up with a communication to them. Be confident without being arrogant. I think as security leads, it's quite interesting to see where I've been in organizations and heard security leads, standing up and presenting and saying, well, if you don't listen to me, the whole world's going to come crashing down. Give me this, otherwise, the consequences are this. Say it with confidence, but say it without being arrogant in regards to told you so. Know your audience. And I think this goes to a little bit to the question you just asked me there, Steve, around strategy. Do research your audience. If you know that the CFO likes to get into the weeds of the numbers, well, if you're targeting them as being your advocate, give him what he wants up front. Try and predict the questions that you're going to be asked. Know the audience. If you know that their focus is going to be elsewhere, well, give them something to engage with. Ask them questions, challenge them. Please never go in unprepared, because you'll be found out very, very, very quickly. The amount of times that I've seen a security lead crumble, and in fact, I've done it in experience when I was younger in the industry and gone in thinking I know it all because I've read a document and gone in there. These people, these board members, know the answers of which they're asking you the questions for. They go in prepared based on what you're going to present to them. You should go in just as prepared, if not more so than them. And I think the biggest one for me is keep it simple, keep it appropriate. Don't go too technically deep. Don't go into stats and figures that are below the level of requirement for the audience. It goes without saying that you need to give them enough information without actually swamping them full of data. They're busy enough as it is, so keep it simple, keep it appropriate. Steve, I'd like to call you in here as a little one here, because this is about being that enabler and not a blocker. Bit of a quote on screen there, sir. Take us through it.
Okay, so by investing in new laptops with a computer CIS hardened build, so that's like one of those prerequisite builds where you're looking at taking all the fluff off of your brand new laptop. And if you get that from a single supplier, then you've got an opportunity to be able to buy in bulk, so you can make some cost savings. You can also get the manufacturer to set them up to a certain spec for you, so you're saving time as well there. You can increase security because you know that you're getting a device that's coming in with a hardened build, so you know that it's going to be up to snuff. You're going to have no bloatware on there. You're going to remove local admin and all those other good stuff. You can improve your device management because there's certain manufacturers out there now who are creating machines that you can do straight enroll onto cloud-based mobile device management platforms. And this is going to upgrade the user's experience because the user's going to get a brand new machine. Now, if you're smart about this, you set up a deal with the supplier, and you'd have like a 3 or 4 year rolling replacement for all of your devices, which means that you've got good asset management in place. See how I got that straight in there. So this would then enable you to become, this would help you to help the business to enable its workforce to work remotely, because now you've got good device management in place. You could get the business to start to save money on office space because we don't need office space quite so much. You're going to close down one of the loopholes of having a remote workforce because you're in control of the devices that workforce is using. And you should be able to save money, because if you think about it, we said earlier that the average cost of a data breach was £4.45 million. And that works out to approximately, what, 4,000? Yeah, 4,000 top of the range laptops. So even if you're a small business, say with 500 people, you should be saving about £4 million there just by having a deal with someone like HP or Dell to sort out some good laptops. I see Lenovo, I've got a Black Friday deal on. Have a word with them, see what you can do about getting a pre-made CIS built laptop for your workforce.
So we're not saying spend more, we're saying spend wiser.
Absolutely, always.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. And again, I think one thing to go through here, Steve.
Well, training, because as you said earlier, 91% of breaches start with an email. So why don't we spend some time training our staff to be able to understand what to expect from a social engineering attack and what to look for in a phishing campaign? If we can turn that 91% down to 19%, what a saving that is, because now we've got an aware workforce and we can wipe away the problems that we might be facing looking at phishing campaigns. Just a thought.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And again, I think, again, being the advocate of training, and if you, everybody does security training and it's click through. If you make it engaging for the organization, make it personable, but actually get the support from a board to actually do it. Again, they then become your enabler. And actually they become your advocate of that training as well. So again, just looking at gaining advocates and not enemies, let's have a look what that looks like. So for me, there's 4 headlines here. It's communicate. Your time with the board is likely to be limited. So cover high level security issues. Your goal here is to actually educate the board on how it's appropriate to them. Ensure that you cover off things like emerging risks and trends. One thing that we've seen of late and quite often targeted at boards are an exponential increase in QR code scan phishing scams. So there's so many of them. Educate the board on that. Not only that, but when you do present, lead with business, not technology. I know Steve's just said about buying new laptops, but actually if you look at the business the business problem first and solve that with technology. Don't talk to them about the technology that's solving it. Talk about the business problem that you're solving. Again, address how cybersecurity affects the strategy, the operations, reputationally with your clients, and the bottom line, reputational with the company if something does go wrong. Lead with risk. Compose a compelling narrative. Illustrate your key messages with real world examples within the sector. There's no point saying that Maersk had a massive, the container shipping company had a massive data breach in 2016 and it's still costing them X amount now. If you're in a completely different sector and organization, keep it apparent, keep it real. If you're in retail, as Steve mentioned earlier, there's credentials out there of retail customers on the dark web at the moment. It should always pose the question, is it us? And if it isn't us, tell the board about that one of your competitors had something wrong, get to the crux of why, and speak to them about it. Stay in touch with them. If you said you were going to follow up with something, follow up with it. If you've been asked a question, follow up with it. It's an example of ensuring that your time with those board members is spent effectively. And again, it helps you then to gain that advocate. If you identify that one of the board members has a real grasp of security, well, then let them be your eyes and ears on the board if you are not part of that table discussion yourself. They can present you and your thoughts when they are there and may have the ears of the more senior management of the organization. Couple of things when presenting. What should I do? I should always incorporate all of my stakeholders, everyone sitting around the table. Like I said, it needs to be appropriate for anyone. Everyone sitting around there should have a part to play in your security strategy. Define what that looks like. Try and stick to your allotted time. Again, what they don't want to do, what most boards don't do, are sit there and saying, no, of course you can have 30 more minutes of our time because we'll just push everybody back. Don't try and cram everything in. You stick to your most important priorities and don't just fill them full of data. If they are driving questions, you can absolutely answer them, but my recommendation would be, that's a great question. For the interest of everybody's time, what I'll do is I'll take that offline with you and I'll come and speak to you. Again, gaining those advocates, gaining that response. If they want an answer then and there, absolutely fine. I think it goes without saying, if you're not used or familiar with presenting to the board, practice it. Practice it at home, practice it on one of your work colleagues, get them to challenge you with questions. And I'll leave you with this, a picture does in fact paint 1,000 words. Don't overcomplicate any form of presentation that you are doing with lots and lots and lots of words. If people can remember a picture, they'll know what they're talking about. They're more able to remember something visually. So with that, I'm going to leave you with a final thought. For those of you on the call, we thank you ever so much for your time. And again, we appreciate that you as the security lead have got lots of other things to do. So we do appreciate you spending time with us this afternoon. With that, we'll draw this to a close and say thank you.